We also see some changes in both labor and the women's rights movement in an attempt to get more progress for these movements. When it comes to labor movement was heavily damaged by violence against workers, and particularly by the perception that workers themselves were violent anarchists intent on overthrowing the capitalist system back in the 1880s. So, a new approach to labor advocacy is founded by the American Federation of Labor, an organization established in the 1890s which tried to remake the labor movement in a way that made it safer, more sort of digestible to American business. One of the things that the American Federation of Labor was focused on was skilled workers and only in certain industry. So, what the American Federation of Labor and their founder, Samuel Gompers, was trying to do was to pick their battles, to pick the group of workers that had the most influence and power, skilled workers, and to pick certain industries where those workers could exert their power. And the AFL's motto officially was what they called business unionism. So they said, look, if we want to make progress, if we want businesses to do things for the betterment of their workers, we need to speak the language of business. Rather than talk about trying to create a socialist utopia, we need to argue that the courts are violating liberty of contract for workers. In other words, the courts, with all these rulings against labor unions, are interfering with the ability of labor unions to negotiate in good faith with their employers. So they're turning that argument against its on its head, basically, by arguing that all of these anti-union rulings were violating the same thing that the Supreme Court said it was trying to uphold. So because of that, the AFL is focusing on things like wages and working conditions. Again, only for skilled workers and only in certain industries. But because of that, there are realistically very few people that the AFL can reach or help. They leave out unskilled labor. They leave out a lot of minority workers, immigrants, some of the biggest industries because of their very narrow focus. And this leaves a bit of a vacuum. What do you do for the vast majority of workers who aren't eligible to be covered by the American Federation of Labor? And this is going to open the door for later groups like the Industrial Workers of the World, aka the Wobblies, to come in and make their pitch to these workers left out of the AFL. For the women's rights movement, the 1890s is also a time of rebuilding, but for a little bit different of a reason. The women's rights movement had been split by the passage of the 15th Amendment, with some women making the argument that the 15th Amendment, which granted the right to vote based regardless of race, right, that said all men had the right to vote, many women argued that this was not great, but it was a step in the right direction. There were other women who argued that any voting rights amendment that did not give women the right to vote was unacceptable. And so there's a split in the suffragette movement in the 1860s that really isn't healed until the 1890s. Women in the 1890s made some progress in women's civil rights. By the 1890s, women could control their own wages and property, which before those things had been controlled by their husband if they were married or their father if they were not. Women were increasingly allowed to form their own legal contracts. And in the year 1900, about 5 million women worked, mostly in areas like domestic service or the garment industry. But that was a big jump in women's participation in the outside workforce. Though most of those women continued to be, like we see in earlier time periods, unmarried and young. The 1890s also starts to see the rise of college-educated women, especially in things like clerical service and professional fields, although they're still a great minority in comparison to men in that area of the workforce. For women's rights activists, a lot of their political energy, because they couldn't vote or hold office yet, is pushed both on the women's suffrage movement to get women the right to vote, but also on various political causes, especially things like the temperance movement and other moral reform movements. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, for example, was initially solely devoted to temperance or the desire to regulate and eventually ban the consumption of alcohol, but gradually it morphed into this more general concern for women's rights, including the right to vote. The most prominent women's rights organization in the United States in the 1890s was the National American Woman Suffrage Association, led by President Carrie Chapman Catt. This was the first reunified suffragette movement following that split in the 1860s over the 15th Amendment. And the suffragette movement at this time used arguments about race and immigration to make the argument that women having the right to vote, particularly white women having the right to vote, would be a solution to concerns over non-white men or immigrants voting, because they made the argument that white women, as members of the superior race, were better educated and thus better qualified to be voters. As you might imagine, this is an organization, if they're arguing this, that is led by fairly elite white women. And so in the 1890s, the women's suffrage movement is pretty solidly white and middle and upper class. They're not yet reaching out to women in lower classes, to immigrant women, to women of color to work together. We're going to see that happen a little bit more during the progressive movement, but that's still an issue within modern feminism today. This issue of advocating women's rights that apply equally to all women and not just focusing on the concerns of one particular group of women. That's going to be something that continues to haunt feminism for the next 100+ years. Speaking of people of color, the next session that we're going to have in our recordings is going to talk about African Americans in the South. What is going on in the Southern United States during the time period after the Civil War to the 1890s? Because we focused a lot so far in this series on the West, on the East, the Midwest, but we haven't really talked about what's going on in the South after the Civil War and what's happening in the South during the Gilded Age. So next time we're going to turn our attention onto the American South, and then we'll finally start to get to the year 1900. Until next time, I'm Dr. Esmacher.